The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Hospital hum overhead like a swarm of insects, casting everything in that particular hospital white that makes human skin look like something preserved in formaldehyde. Katie Rodriguez arrives on a Tuesday in September, her scrubs 2 sizes too large, her hair pulled back so tight it leaves red crescents on her temples. Nobody notices her. That's the point. The ICU smells like antiseptic and something underneath it, something like copper and regret, and Katie moves through it with the kind of precision that comes from having done this in places where hesitation meant watching someone bleed out on a concrete floor. Her shoes are worn Danskos, the kind every nurse wears, the kind nobody remembers. Her badge photo shows someone with tired eyes and no history worth mentioning. According to her file, Katie Rodriguez graduated from Georgia Southern with a BSN in 2015, worked at Mercy General in Atlanta for 4 years, and transferred to St. Michael's 3 weeks ago. The file does not mention Baghdad. It does not mention the 75th Ranger Regiment or Task Force Black or the 3 soldiers she pulled through enemy fire on a night when the desert temperature hit 127 degrees and everything that wasn't metal was on fire. The file does not mention Captain. Her hands are the only thing that might give her away. The knuckles bear pale scar tissue from shrapnel that came through a Humvee windshield in Fallujah, puckered lines that catch the light in ways that tell a story if anyone bothers to read it. But nurses have scarred hands. Nurses have accidents. No one looks twice. She's been at St. Michael's for 17 days when Dr. Mercer notices her during morning rounds, though notice might not be the right word. His gaze passes over her the way light passes through water, acknowledged but not absorbed, present but not registering. He's examining a patient in bed 7, room 704, an elderly man with COPD whose oxygen saturation keeps drifting down to 88 despite the high-flow cannula. The residents cluster around like satellites orbiting a planet, their white coats still crisp, their confidence still intact. Dr. Mercer is holding the chart, his fingers steady on the paper, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from 23 years at the top of every room he enters. Katie finishes logging the morning vitals into the electronic medical record at the nurse's station 30 feet away, but the ICU doesn't really have distance, it has acoustics. Every word Dr. Mercer speaks travels the same way blood travels through arteries. Essential. Unavoidable. Who placed this for? He asks, his voice pitched just loud enough that half the unit can hear. The for in question is in the patient's left forearm, a clean 20-gauge placement in the basilic vein, exactly where it should be. The kind of placement that takes someone who knows anatomy well enough that they don't have to think about it anymore. I did, Katie says from the nurse's station, not moving. Her voice is soft. Appropriately deferential. The kind of voice people forget the moment it stops speaking. Dr. Mercer turns, and for just a moment, something flickers across his face, not quite recognition, but something close to it. He's tall, the kind of tall that makes him have to look down even from 30 feet away, and he's studying her the way a mechanic studies an engine that's making an unusual sound. His eyes are pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and they move across her face like he's taking inventory of something he might need to remember later. This is below standard, he says finally, and it's not even a lie, which is what makes it worse. It's not an accusation. It's a statement of fact delivered in front of 6 residents, 2 medical students, and a nursing assistant who's trying very hard not to make eye contact with anyone. When you lower standards, outcomes decline. Patient safety is not negotiable. Competence is not optional. The words hang in the air like smoke. Nobody moves. Nobody speaks. Katie's jaw tightens, just barely, the way a muscle tightens when it's asked to hold something heavier than it should have to carry. Her hands continue their work on the keyboard without stopping, without hesitation, without even a moment of pause that might be mistaken for emotion. That's the hardest part. The not flinching. Dr. Mercer turns back to his patient, and the moment passes the way most moments pass, it simply ends. The rounds continue. The residents trail behind him like he's pulling them on invisible strings. By lunchtime, no one will remember exactly what he said or why, but they'll remember that Katie Rodriguez is the kind of nurse you don't ask for help unless you're desperate. She's been monitoring the supply orders since day 3. The Pentagon audit flagged the irregularities 6 months ago: phantom equipment orders, invoices for items never delivered, a paper trail of medical supplies that existed in ledgers but not in inventory. $53,000 in padding spread across 3 quarters, carefully disguised in line items that looked legitimate if you didn't know to look closer. If you didn't have someone on the inside. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division reached out to the Pentagon's Office of Inspector General, and the Pentagon reached out to the person who could get close enough to observe without raising suspicion. A nurse. Someone invisible. Someone the doctors wouldn't even notice existed. Katie was working in Portland when the call came through, on a secure line to a phone she kept in her locker next to the folded flag from Marcus Chen's funeral. The flag is small, regulation size, 3 feet by 5 feet when fully extended, and she keeps it folded in the regulation triangle the way they folded it when they handed it to his mother. His name is stitched on the corner in letters so small they're almost illegible, and she's never shown anyone. She doesn't need to. Every night at 11:19 p.m., Katie logs into the hospital's supply management system using a standard nurse credentials. She doesn't hack the system. She's just a nurse looking at what nurses are supposed to look at, the records of what the hospital ordered and what the hospital received. And every night, she finds the same discrepancies. The same phantom orders. The same padding in the same account managed by the same director of medical procurement, Dr. Mercer's brother-in-law, a man named Garrett Pierce who works in logistics and has access to every supply contract the hospital maintains. The money flows like this: Pierce orders equipment from approved vendors, the vendors deliver partial shipments while inflating the invoices, and the difference gets flagged in the system as delivered but missing. Write it off as loss. Claim the insurance. Move on. 53,000 becomes 78,000 becomes the kind of number that buys things. Nice things. Things that don't come with serial numbers. And Dr. Mercer knows. The emails prove it. Katie has photographed every one with a disposable camera, actual film, not digital, nothing that leaves traces in the cloud, and mailed them to a post office box in Arlington, Virginia. The box is run by someone she's never met, someone who works for someone she's never met, someone in a chain of command that leads back to Fort Bragg and the kind of authority that doesn't appear on organizational charts. She's been a nurse for 8 days. She's been Captain Katie Rodriguez for 17 years before that. The afternoon shift brings the usual rhythm, vital signs every 4 hours, medications on their schedule, the endless documentation that turns human suffering into digital records. Katie moves through the ICU like she's part of the building's infrastructure, one more necessary system among so many other necessary systems. She checks the Foley catheters and the ventilator settings and the 4 lines, and nobody speaks to her except to ask for things. Can you adjust the bedside rails? Can you bring another blanket? Can you check the monitor? I think the lead is loose. She says yes to everything. She says it quietly. She says it the way someone says things when they understand that their opinion is not valued, only their labor. At 3:15 p.m., Dr. Mercer appears at the nurse's station with a folder in his hand, and for a moment his expression shifts into something that looks almost like concern. He's standing across the desk from her, and the space between them feels electric with something she can't quite name. His eyes are on her again, searching, and she meets his gaze with the kind of blankness that comes from training. You learn not to blink when people are trying to read you. You learn to give them nothing. Your charting is adequate, he says, and it's clearly meant as a compliment, though his tone suggests he's saying something else entirely. But adequate is never good enough. Not here. Katie nods. She doesn't argue. Arguments require engagement, and engagement would be a mistake. Instead, she says, "Of course, Doctor," in a voice so soft that he has to lean forward slightly to hear it, and she watches his jaw tighten the way jaws tighten when someone realizes they're being underestimated but can't quite figure out how. By the time he walks away, she's already returned to her documentation, her hand steady on the keyboard, her expression unchanged. The folded flag sits in her locker 1 floor below, and the photographs sit in a mailbox 2 states away, and the spreadsheet of discrepancies grows by 1 more entry every single night. She'll be here for another 6 weeks. Maybe 7. Long enough for the pattern to become undeniable. Long enough for the Pentagon to build a case so airtight that even a man like Mercer can't lawyer his way out of it. Long enough to do what she came to do without anyone knowing she was ever anything other than what they see. Just a nurse. Quiet. Forgettable. The kind of person you look right through. That's what he doesn't know. That's what none of them know. The room went dead silent. This is what happens when we lower our standards, Dr. Mercer said, holding up Katie's for placement documentation so the resident cluster could see. His voice carried across bed 7 like a blade finding its mark. He turned the chart slowly, deliberately, letting them study the stick sites, the slight hesitation marks where the needle had adjusted once before threading. Note the multiple attempts. Were you even trained, or did you learn from YouTube? The residents chuckled nervously. One of them, a third year named Harrison, actually smirked. Katie's jaw clenched. Just once. A single tightening of muscle that lasted less than a second. Then it released. Her pen continued moving across the vital sheet in front of her, steady as a metronome, documenting blood pressure, oxygen saturation, heart rate. The documentation never wavered. Her handwriting never shook. Around her, the other nurses suddenly became very interested in their own charts, their own patients, anything that wasn't her face. Dr. Mercer watched her for a moment, waiting for something, a flinch, a tear, an apology. When nothing came, he turned back to the residents and continued grand rounds like she was furniture. She was still thinking about that moment for hours later when her coffee went cold by the vending machine. Rodriguez. His voice cut across the nurse's station like a surgical saw through bone. Did you even read the chart before administering that diuretic? Dr. Mercer stood 15 feet away, one hand holding Mr. Patterson's file, the other gesticulating to the gathered nurses and techs like he was conducting an orchestra of incompetence. His face had that particular shade of red that came from righteous indignation, or performance. With Dr. Mercer, it was always performance. The patient has a documented sulfur allergy, he continued, his volume never dropping, making sure every corner of the station could hear. This is nursing 101, people. This is basic competency. The kind of thing we teach in the first week of nursing school. Katie set down her coffee with deliberate slowness. The cup made a soft clink against the counter. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his for exactly 1 second before shifting to something neutral, neither defiant nor submissive. Just present. Sir, the medication was furosemide, she said. Her voice was flat, factual, empty of inflection. Like she was reading vitals to a resident. It's not cross-reactive with sulfur antibiotics despite the structural similarity. The allergy documentation specifies Bactrim and other sulfonamides. Different mechanism entirely. The station went very quiet. Dr. Mercer's face deepened from red to something approaching purple. His jaw worked for a moment before words came out, short, clipped words that fell like hammer blows. Don't lecture me on pharmacology, Nurse Rodriguez. You're here to follow orders. Not to think. Not to interpret. To follow orders. He turned to the charge nurse, Patricia, who was suddenly very focused on her computer screen. Put her name down for remedial training, Dr. Mercer said. Clearly our little Florence Nightingale needs help with basic competencies. The nickname landed differently than the others. The others were insults. This one was a cage. Florence Nightingale, the founder of modern nursing, the lady with the lamp, the angel in the darkness, the woman who'd revolutionized medical care. Reduced to a dismissive diminutive in his mouth. A way of saying, you're not even qualified to carry her legacy. Every face at the station found something fascinating to study. Charts. Keyboards. The ceiling tiles with their water stains and missing acoustic panels. Patricia's fingers kept clicking through screens even though her eyes weren't moving. Katie returned to her documentation. The pen picked up exactly where it had left off. Her shoulders didn't tense. Her breathing didn't quicken. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, the kind of restraint that comes from having already survived things that would break ordinary people. Baghdad had taught her that control. Control was power. Control was survival. Control was the difference between staying alive and becoming a name on a memorial wall. But that wasn't the worst part. That evening, Dr. Mercer appeared in the break room where Katie sat alone eating a container of yogurt and pretending to read a nursing journal. He didn't sit down. He dropped a folder on the table with deliberate force, the kind of move that was meant to make her jump. She didn't jump. "Security will escort you out if you continue practicing beyond your scope," he said quietly. His voice had that particular timbre now, not angry, but cold. Calculating. The voice of someone who'd just moved from crude bullying to strategic destruction. "I've documented 3 protocol violations this week. 1 more and I'll have grounds for immediate termination. Just 1 more." He left without waiting for a response. Katie opened the folder. 3 incident reports, each one meticulously filled out in his precise handwriting. Dates. Times. Specific violations. Every citation carefully researched and worded in language that would withstand legal scrutiny. The bureaucratic architecture of dismantling someone's career, built brick by careful brick. She read through them slowly, mechanically, the way she'd read intelligence briefings in the compound near Fallujah. This was a different kind of enemy, not one with weapons but with institutions, with policy, with the overwhelming weight of systems designed to protect people like him. The second report was about a medication she'd questioned. The third was about her completing a task before the resident arrived, eager initiative that somehow became overstepping. Each one was technically defensible if you squinted at it the right way. Together, they painted a picture of a nurse who couldn't follow protocol, who overstepped her authority, who was a liability waiting to happen. She closed the folder and picked up her yogurt again. It had warmed while she read. She ate it anyway. The night shift was quiet until 22:47 hours when the admission bell chimed for room 304. A 62-year-old veteran, James Sullivan, admitted for confusion and dizziness. Katie took one look at his chart and saw the medication interaction, a diuretic combined with an ACE inhibitor in a patient whose renal function was already compromised. Sullivan's blood pressure was dropping. His heart rate was climbing. His skin had that particular cool, clammy quality that came right before total cardiovascular collapse. She was with him when his monitor started showing the early signs of deterioration. His vitals were tanking. His oxygen saturation was 88 and falling. The on-call resident was stuck in traffic on Victory Drive, 20 minutes minimum, and Sullivan's rhythm was becoming increasingly erratic. Katie made the decision in the time it took to blink. Sullivan needed vascular access that could handle rapid medication delivery. Central line. Now. She moved to the crash cart with a kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory deeper than her nursing license. Ultrasound probe. 18-gauge needle. Guide wire. Dilator. Triple lumen catheter. She'd done this procedure 47 times in her career, but 43 of those had been in Hums rolling through Sadr City, in blown-out medical tents in Helmand province with artillery shaking the walls, in the back of a C-130 at 8,000 feet with a patient who wasn't supposed to survive. Her hands moved on their own. The needle found the vein on the first attempt, threading through subclavian access with a confidence that came from having done impossible things under impossible circumstances. She secured the guide wire, advanced the dilator, threaded the catheter home. Her hands used the 3-point anchor technique, a special forces modification that was faster than the textbook approach, more stable, more reliable when things were falling apart. The kind of technique you only learned when survival depended on speed. Sullivan's eyes fluttered open mid-procedure. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, his eyes focused on her hands. On the positioning. On the specific way she was anchoring the catheter. On the muscle memory made manifest. His lips moved. Medic 6. His voice was barely a whisper, half-conscious, pulled from somewhere deep in the vault of memory where trauma lives. Katie's hands froze for exactly 1 heartbeat. Then she continued. Flushed the line. Ran normal saline. Started the antibiotics that Sullivan's system desperately needed. His oxygen saturation climbed 88, 90, 93, 96. His heart rate steadied. The monitor rhythm shifted from chaotic to purposeful. From dying to living. Sullivan's eyes closed again. He was unconscious but stable. He was alive. That was when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, holding the folder he'd been building all day. That central line should have waited for the physician, he said. His voice was ice-cold now, the temperature of someone who knew exactly what he'd just seen and understood precisely what it meant. You've just practiced medicine without a license, Rodriguez. That's a felony. Katie didn't respond. She was watching Sullivan's monitor, where his sinus rhythm had finally settled into something stable and strong. Her hands were still trembling, but not from fear. Not from anything Dr. Mercer could understand. She'd kept a man alive who should have died waiting for permission to save his own life. And now the real nightmare was beginning. The night shift at St. Michael's moved like a heartbeat, steady, predictable, and utterly deceptive. Katie pushed the medication cart down the third-floor corridor at 11:36 p.m., her shoes making no sound against the linoleum, just the soft whisper of rubber on wax tile. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made people look either peaceful or dead, sometimes both. Room 304 was at the end of the East Wing, where the quieter patients were kept, the ones whose families had stopped calling as frequently. James Sullivan lay still in the bed when Katie entered, his chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of a man whose body had decided to conserve energy. 62 years old. Admitted through the ER 6 hours ago with a medication interaction that had triggered an arrhythmia. The chart notes read like a tragedy in shorthand: Vietnam veteran, widowed, living alone, no next of kin listed. His blood pressure was drifting downward, 98/62, the kind of number that whispered problems if you knew how to listen. Katie checked the 4 line, a peripheral stick in his left arm, adequate for now, but she could already see where this was heading. The medications they'd started weren't stabilizing him. They were just buying time. She spent the next hour documenting vitals, adjusting the cardiac monitor leads, checking his oxygen saturation, all the invisible work that kept people alive while the doctors slept. Sullivan's eyes remained closed. His breathing remained labored. By 1:15 a.m., his pressure had dropped to 92/58, and his heart rate was climbing into the 120s, a body in distress, candles burning down in both directions at once. Katie called the on-call resident, a second-year named Chen, who answered with the particular irritation of someone whose sleep had been interrupted. She gave him the vitals. She told him the trends. She waited for orders that didn't come immediately because Chen was 6 years out of medical school and still believed that waiting often fixed more than doing. Start him on norepinephrine, Katie said when the silence stretched too long. His perfusion is tanking. I'll be up to assess, Chen replied, which wasn't the same as saying yes. But 30 seconds after she hung up the phone, Katie's clinical instinct, the part of her that had been trained in field medicine, in triage under fire, in the mathematics of who lived and who didn't, told her that 30 seconds might be the margin they didn't have. She'd seen this pattern before in Baghdad. She'd seen it in the back of a Humvee with IED shrapnel tearing through soft tissue. A man declining, the decline accelerating, the window closing. Sullivan's arms had begun that subtle restless movement that meant his brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. His lips were taking on a grayish cast, the color of fading. Katie moved to the bedside and pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves with a snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The central line kit was already in the room, protocol for unstable patients, and her hands found it the way a pianist finds keys in the dark. Sterile field. Ultrasound machine. The cold kiss of chlorhexidine as she prepped his neck. She'd done this procedure 11 times in combat, in tents and bombed-out clinics, in the spaces between breathing and not breathing. The anatomy of the internal jugular vein was the same in Baghdad as it was in Savannah. The body's highways were universal. The needle went in. Her touch was perfect, The kind of perfect that only comes from muscle memory, from hands that have learned something so completely they know it better than the conscious mind does. The ultrasound showed the vein clear and dark, a river of blood right where it was supposed to be. She threaded the guide wire through, felt the familiar give of tissue yielding, the specific resistance of vessels accepting an instrument. Then came the three-point anchor technique, the signature mark of her training, the way she'd been taught to play central lines in the field where you didn't have sterile technique and you couldn't afford complications. 3 separate points of fixation, each tied with a precision knot that felt more like surgery than nursing. The catheter slid into place. The line was live. Blood flowed through it with the dark red certainty of access established. "Hang the lever, Fed," Katie said, her voice level as she taped the final dressing. "Run it wide open." It was then that James Sullivan's eyes opened. They opened with the sudden focus of consciousness reasserting itself, of a mind clawing back from the edge of collapse. His pupils dilated, focusing on her face, on her hands, on the specific angle of her body as she worked. For maybe 2 seconds, not longer, Sullivan's hand reached up and gripped her wrist. His voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from intubation, the sound of a man who hadn't spoken in hours and whose throat was made of broken glass. "Medic 6, he breathed. "That you, Medic 6? Then his eyes closed again, and he was gone, back into whatever dimness his body was retreating to, but his hand remained on her wrist for 3 more heartbeats before falling away. Katie didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't react in any way that would register on a monitor or a chart. Her hands remained steady as they pushed the lever fed through the line, as she secured the 4-pole, as she checked his vitals and noted them in the computer. Sullivan's oxygen saturation began climbing almost immediately, 92, now 95, now 96. His blood pressure stabilized. The medication was doing its work, but it was her work that had made it possible. The central line was the gateway. Everything else followed from that. She was documenting in the computer when she heard the footsteps in the hallway. Fast footsteps. Purposeful. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway like a storm system moving through, his face already arranged into the expression of a man who had been told something that confirmed his worst suspicions about someone he already despised. His eyes took in the scene, the central line in place, the lever fed running, Sullivan's vitals climbing back into survivable territory, and something in his jaw tightened. "What did you do?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed as a question, the tone of voice that suggested he already knew the answer and was simply looking for confirmation that would justify what came next. His pressure was dropping, Katie said. She didn't look at him. She continued documenting. He needed access. You placed a central line without a physician present. His perfusion was failing. I called Chen. I stabilized him. Dr. Mercer stepped closer to the bed, and Katie could smell the coffee on his breath, the particular staleness of a man who'd been awake too long, who'd been brooding about his problems. He looked at Sullivan's neck, at the placement she'd made, at the tape and dressing that sealed it in place with the kind of precision that could only come from specific training. "This is way beyond your scope," Mercer said. His voice was quiet now, which was worse than when he yelled. Quiet meant conviction. Quiet meant he'd already decided. "You're a nurse. You don't play central lines. You don't make clinical decisions about medications. You certainly don't exceed your authority without explicit physician orders." Katie saved his life, she thought. She didn't say it. Instead, she closed the chart with a click of the keyboard, and when she turned to face him, her expression was exactly what it had been all week, neutral, professional, the mask of someone who understood the hierarchy and accepted her place in it. But something had changed in her eyes. Something that Mercer registered even if he couldn't have articulated it. A clarity. A kind of knowing. "I followed protocol," she said. "The central line kit is standard placement for unstable patients. The medications I requested came from the on-call resident. Everything's documented." "I'll decide what's documented," Mercer said. He pulled out his phone with the gesture of a man beginning something, not ending it. His thumbs moved across the screen. This is exactly the kind of cowboy approach I've been warning HR about. This hospital has standards. This hospital has protocols. And he looked at her the way someone looks at a problem that suddenly became a crisis. You think you can just circumvent them whenever you feel like it. He was already dialing. Katie could see it in the way his posture had shifted, the way he was positioning himself, the beginning of the machinery that would grind toward justification. She'd seen this before, not in hospitals, but in military tribunals, in the endless paperwork of blame assignment, in the way institutions protected themselves by finding a single person to sacrifice. "I'm calling risk management," Mercer said. "And I'm filing a formal incident report. You performed an invasive procedure you're not qualified to perform. You bypassed the chain of command. You potentially violated Joint Commission standards on scope of practice." The phone rang and someone answered and Mercer began to speak, his voice taking on the particular tone of a man explaining a crisis to someone with authority over consequences. Katie stepped past him into the hallway, where the lights still hummed and Sullivan's vital signs still traced across the monitor screen, showing the small victory of a man whose heart was still beating because someone had known what to do when the protocol said to wait. She had 72 hours before Mercer built enough of a case to demand her termination. She could feel it. The machinery was moving now. And somewhere in room 304, James Sullivan was alive because a captain in the Special Forces had remembered everything she'd been taught and hadn't bothered to ask permission to save a life. 2 days. 48 hours. That's how long it took for James Sullivan's lungs to betray him. He was sleeping when the air pocket formed in his chest cavity, a pocket of trapped atmosphere that pressed against his heart with the relentless force of a fist clenching inside his ribcage. The tension pneumothorax didn't announce itself with drama. It announced itself with oxygen that wouldn't climb and a heart rate that wouldn't stop climbing, with a trachea that shifted sideways like a compass needle spinning wild. The code alarm sounded at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday, filtering through the hospital speakers in that clipped, emotionless voice, "Code Blue, ICU room 304. Katie was on the 4th floor, restocking a crash cart, her hands moving with the mechanical precision they always moved with. The intercom crackled again. Room 304. The veteran. The one she'd saved 48 hours ago by using hands trained in a war zone instead of hands trained in a classroom. She moved. Not ran. Nurses don't run in hospitals, they walk with purpose, but she moved like muscle memory had overridden the rulebook, and by the time she reached the ICU, her scrubs were already sticking to her ribs with the kind of sweat that comes from knowing exactly what death looks like when it's moving fast. Dr. Mercer was already in the hallway outside Sullivan's room, his tall frame planted in the doorway like a gate, his arms crossed over his chest. His face had the expression of a man who'd been rehearsing this moment since the needle decompression 2 days ago, the moment he'd watched her hands move with certainty that didn't belong to a nurse named Katie Rodriguez from Jacksonville. "You're not assigned here," he said. His voice carried that particular quality of precision that comes from building a case, word by careful word. "Step back." Behind him, through the small reinforced window in the door, Katie could see the monitor. Sullivan's oxygen saturation was dropping into the 70s, that telltale red number that meant the oxygen trucks in his blood were running empty. His heart rate climbed past 140, past 150, a rhythm that screamed desperation in electrical pulses. The code team was still 90 seconds out. Katie could calculate it the way she calculated everything now. 2 emergencies on the ground floor. 1 team already mobilized. The stairwell would slow them. Time was the enemy, and time was liquid, flowing away. "He has a tension pneumothorax," Katie said. Her voice came out level. Not a request. Just information. Second rib space. Trachea's deviated left. He needs immediate decompression or heel arrest. Dr. Mercer's jaw tightened. His eyes, which had been angry for 2 days, became something colder. Something that knew it held the power to let a man die. "The code team will handle it," he said. "You're already under investigation, Ms. Rodriguez. If you touch that patient, you're terminated. Effective immediately." Do you understand what I'm saying? The monitor behind him beeped. Oxygen at 68% now. Falling like a stone down a well. Katie looked at Sullivan's face through the glass, saw the cyanosis creeping up his neck like frost on a window, saw his mouth opening and closing with the gasping of a man whose lungs were collapsing inward, and made the choice she'd made 1,000 times in Baghdad when protocol and survival pointed in different directions. She pushed past Dr. Mercer. Not violently. Just with the immovable certainty of a woman who weighed 140 pounds but moved like she weighed twice that. His hand caught her shoulder, and she didn't break stride. The touch slid off her the way water slides off oil. The room smelled like antiseptic and fierce wet. Sullivan's chest was heaving, his ribs pulling inward with each desperate breath. Katie was already at the crash cart, her fingers finding the 14-gauge catheter without her eyes leaving his face. The needle was long. 14-gauge. Designed for this moment, though Sullivan didn't know that. She counted his ribs with the flat of her palm, 1, 2, right hand positioned at the midclavicular line, her fingers reading his anatomy like Braille. Her body remembered Baghdad. Her hands remembered the Marine in Fallujah whose name tag had read Sullivan and whose blood had been arterial, bright, moving fast. This Sullivan was still breathing. She intended to keep him that way. The needle went in at 90 degrees, straight between the second and third ribs, no hesitation, no uncertainty. The hiss that followed sounded like air escaping a tire, like pressure equalizing, like physics remembering how it worked when death wasn't standing in the doorway judging you for saving a life. Sullivan's chest expanded. The sound came again, his lungs drawing in air instead of fighting for it. His oxygen saturation began climbing. 72%. 76%. 81%. His color returned like someone had switched on a light beneath his skin. His eyes focused. They found her face. His mouth moved. Medic 6, he whispered. The code team arrived 90 seconds later, and by then, Captain Katie Rodriguez was no longer the unremarkable nurse who pushed meds and restocked crash carts. She was standing in the corner of the room with a chart in her hands, documenting what had happened in the clinical language of medicine, while her hands trembled not with fear but with the restraint of someone who understood that the real danger was only beginning. Dr. Mercer was already on his phone in the hallway, speaking with the rapid-fire precision of a man executing a plan he'd prepared days in advance. Katie could hear the murmur of his voice through the closed door, the words not clear but the tone unmistakable, executing. Documenting. Building a case so airtight that no administrator in the hospital could ignore it. By 3:15 p.m., she was in the HR office on the second floor, sitting across from a woman named Patricia Stiles who had the exhausted expression of someone who'd been given paperwork to process that she didn't understand. Gross violation of scope of practice, Patricia read, her voice thin and apologetic. Performing procedures reserved for medical doctors without authorization. Putting a patient at risk through unauthorized intervention. Immediate termination for cause. The forms were already signed. Dr. Mercer's signature on 6 pages. The chief medical officer's countersignature on 3 more. Insurance paperwork flagged and filed. The whole machine had been set in motion the moment Katie's hands had done what her title said she wasn't allowed to do. "You saved his life," Katie said. Not an argument. Just the fact. Patricia flinched. "Ms. Rodriguez, according to this incident report, you performed an emergency procedure that could have resulted in patient harm. You were out of your scope of practice. The hospital has to protect itself. I'm sorry. Truly. But you need to clear your locker and turn in your badge." The rain started an hour later, when Katie was already at the bus stop 3 blocks away, a cardboard box balanced against her left hip. Inside the box, a cracked ceramic coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a wilted succulent with brown edges that hadn't survived her attention, and a folded American flag smaller than a dinner napkin, the fabric worn soft from too many hands holding it. The flag had Marcus's name stitched into one corner in military lettering. Marcus Chen, 2003 to 2005. Marcus, whose blood was darker than you'd think when arterial pressure was involved. Marcus, whose last words had been in Arabic, which she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear in the way his hand had let go of hers. The rain fell in sheets now, the kind of rain that hammers parking lots like applause, like judgment. It streaked her face, and she didn't wipe it away because rain and tears looked the same on a dark November afternoon and there was no point in distinguishing between them. The water ran off the flag's fabric, soaking into the fibers the way blood soaked into combat fatigues, the way some stains never truly wash out. Her phone buzzed. Text message from a number that wasn't in her contacts, a number that never would be. Mission status. Katie stared at the screen. The Pentagon was asking her to report. The cover was blown. Sullivan would talk. The medical staff had seen her hands move with certainty that no civilian-trained nurse possessed. Dr. Mercer had documented everything with the precision of a man building a prosecution case. The whole operation, the whole careful architecture of her unremarkable persona, had collapsed in the time it took to push a needle through the space between two ribs. She didn't text back. She just stood at the bus stop in the rain, watching the flag's fabric absorb water the way it had absorbed everything else, and understood that some choices didn't require Pentagon approval. Some choices were just what you did when someone's lungs were collapsing and the world stopped watching and all that remained was the difference between a person who lived and a person who didn't. The call came at 8:22 a.m., routed through the hospital switchboard to administration, a routine background check that flagged something impossible. Katie's file contained a classified security clearance requiring Pentagon authorization just to access the metadata. The hospital CEO's hands trembled holding the phone receiver as a voice on the other end, calm, federal, unmistakably official, requested immediate access to patient James Sullivan's medical records and nursing documentation. Within 20 minutes, two men in dress uniforms walked through St. Michael's ICU doors like the air itself had changed pressure. Their shoes clicked against tile with the precision of men accustomed to being obeyed. No introduction. No pleasantries. They moved to Sullivan's bedside, and the entire unit held its breath. Sullivan sat propped against three pillows, color returning to his face day by day, lungs expanding without the knife twist of pneumothorax pain. His eyes found Katie across the room, and he smiled the way soldiers smile when they recognize their own, not with teeth, but with something deeper, recognition that transcends paperwork and rank. The colonel stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of official record, and read the citation aloud, Captain Katie Rodriguez, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Acting without regard for personal safety, Captain Rodriguez provided emergency medical intervention under fire, preserving the life of Gunnery Sergeant James Sullivan and 17 other personnel during a complex ambush situation in Fallujah. His words settled over the room like a weight dropping into still water. Bronze Star. A pause. Silver Star. Another pause, longer this time. The hospital staff understood what they were hearing. A nurse. Their nurse. Decorated for valor. Sullivan's voice cracked when he spoke. Medic 6 saved my life twice, he said quietly, his eyes locked on Katie. Once in Fallujah. Once here. The second colonel produced a leather dress uniform jacket, and across its left chest, silver captain's bars caught the fluorescent light. They laid it across the chair beside Sullivan's bed like an offering, like evidence, like the answer to a question that had haunted every hallway in this hospital for weeks. Katie stood motionless, her composure unshattered, her breathing steady, her hands perfectly still at her sides. The mask she'd worn, the quiet deference, the acceptance of humiliation, the silence, had cracked open 2 days ago when she performed a procedure with hands trained in Baghdad, and now it lay shattered across every surface of this hospital like broken glass, impossible to miss, impossible to unsee. That's when Dr. Mercer pushed through the gathering crowd, his face flushed the color of rage or shock or the kind of comprehension that arrives too late. What is this? His voice cracked. What's happening here? He looked from the colonels to the uniform to Katie, and the understanding moved across his face like a fever breaking. His mouth opened. Closed. The woman he'd mocked during grand rounds, the one he'd called careless and reckless and beneath professional standards, stood in the presence of federal military officers reading her Vela citation. His mind, efficient enough at fraud, struggled with the recalibration. Katie met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, and in that look, he saw what he'd been standing next to for weeks without understanding. A predator doesn't lose teeth just because it works retail. The colonel with the citation simply nodded at Mercer, a gesture that carried all the contempt of a superior officer acknowledging something beneath him. Mercer's face drained of color. Within an hour, he received notification of administrative leave. But the real destruction was already in motion. Tommy Chen, the hospital IT specialist who'd watched Dr. Mercer's contempt directed at Katie across 3 shifts, had made his choice. He approached the FBI agents with a USB drive that contained 18 months of deleted emails, every conversation about consulting arrangements with MedSupply Solutions, invoices billing $4,800 for equipment that cost $1,200 wholesale, purchase orders that didn't match inventory reports. Security footage showed Mercer removing equipment from the medical supply room at 2:14 a.m., loading it into his personal vehicle, timestamps matching exactly with the inventory discrepancies Katie had documented in her first week. Chen had captured it all: the methodical theft, the administrative cover-up, the sophisticated nature of someone who understood hospital systems well enough to exploit them. The USB drive was handed over with a single sentence: "He made a mistake." He thought she was weak. The agents took the drive, thanked Chen with a nod, and walked out of the hospital with enough evidence to begin federal charges within 48 hours. The investigation moved with the speed of institutional machinery once activated. The state medical board opened a file the next day. Federal prosecutors assembled a task force the day after that. MedSupply Solutions records were subpoenaed. Mercer's bank statements revealed deposits that corresponded precisely with hospital supply purchases. A $12,000 deposit on March 15 matched a $4,800 overbilled invoice from March 14, money flowing in a pattern too obvious once someone looked, too convenient to be coincidence. The indictment came down a month later, 47 pages detailing healthcare fraud, theft of government property, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud. Federal charges carried federal sentencing guidelines. Mercer's attorney negotiated a plea deal: surrender his medical license, cooperate with the investigation, accept responsibility. 18 months in federal prison. 5 years supervised release. Restitution of $340,000. His wife filed for divorce during the sentencing hearing, taking their house in the settlement. His country club membership was quietly revoked. The Savannah Morning News ran a 3-column story with his photograph and the word fraud in letters as tall as his face. Every hospital within 300 miles received a notice about his license revocation. When he was released after 14 months for good behavior, the only employment he could secure was driving a medical supply van. The same company that had paid him kickbacks, now operating under federal oversight, required as part of their own plea agreement to hire him back in a visible position, a living reminder of consequences. 6 months later, Katie stood in her new office on the 3rd floor, director of nursing, corner windows overlooking the parking lot. The nameplate on her door read her rank and title in letters of brushed steel. Below, a medical supply van pulled into the loading bay, and she watched Dr. Mercer step out wearing a company uniform with his name stitched over the pocket that had once held expensive pens and a hospital ID marked medical director. An orderly waved him toward the dock. He moved without argument, without the flash of authority that had once filled hallways. He was a man reduced to his actions, which was all any person ever was, really. Katie didn't feel triumph watching him. She felt the hollow absence of satisfaction, the same emptiness that came with watching people fail because they'd underestimated things they couldn't see. She turned back to her desk, where Sullivan's thank you card stood propped against her computer monitor. "You saved me twice. That's 2 more times than I deserved." Outside, rain began, the kind that hammers parking lots like applause for people nobody's watching, and Katie let it sound against the windows while she reviewed staffing reports for the next shift. The call to action wasn't about victory. It was about what came next. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.